Does ChatGPT understand housing law, and can you use it to make good challenges to councils? The answer is no, but yes, actually. Some really interesting stuff I found around all this. And I'm a bit of a dinosaur. I've never had a smartphone. I'm still on the old Nokia. And it wasn't until someone put a comment on this channel basically saying that they'd used ChatGPT to secure a good outcome that I actually wanted to kind of look into it in a bit more detail. So I went onto the website, chatgpt.com. You don't have to log in or anything as far as I can tell. I think you've got unlimited use of it. And basically just started asking it about a number of situations and asked it to write different appeal letters or review request letters or complaints. And although there are certainly limitations with it, I was really impressed by how it kind of works, and I've got no idea how it does work. It clearly doesn't understand homelessness law in any detail, but it does recognise terminology, so it did some odd things which was quite impressive at various points. But as I say, there are some limitations to it. And just to understand what I'm talking about here, so when a council reaches certain decisions, primarily the most important one is the Section 184 decision, which is made just after the relief period ends. Technically it should be day 57, so 57 days after the relief duty starts is when they should issue a decision, basically which is going to be whether or not you're owed the main housing duty or not if you get that far. So that's kind of, are you in priority needs, are you homeless, are you intentionally homeless, stuff like that. And at that point in time, the only way you can challenge the decision is what's called asking for a review, and the fancy section number is section 202. So you're basically making a section 202 review request, even if you don't use it in that terms. At the end of the section 184 letter, it should explain what you need to do if you don't agree with the decision, and that you've got 21 days from receiving the letter to actually ask for a review of it. So it's not the same thing as an appeal. The appeal comes later. That's section 204. And that really does need to be done by a solicitor, in my opinion, because by that stage you do need to know the kind of technicalities of the law. But at the Section 202 stage, there's no reason why a layperson can't do it and actually get a very good outcome. Most of my work spent at Just Us in Bedford was just basically doing that, exactly that, either complaining or making Section 202 review requests at a very high hit rate in terms of getting decisions overturned, essentially because the council was so bad at making them in the first place. So they were quite easy to challenge. And as I say, you don't need to have any particularly fancy language. All you need to do is explain that you don't agree with the decision, and really you want to say why you don't agree with it. So technically, you can get a review requested without actually giving any reasoning for it. You can just say, I don't agree with the decision. But that's probably not the best way to operate. You probably want to give the council the reason that you think they're wrong. And this is where you need to have some understanding of housing law, although it doesn't need to be perfect. I'll give an example, first of all, of how it didn't work, just to sort of see how this limitation works out in practice. And basically, I put this into ChatGPT. Please write me a letter challenging the council's decision that I'm intentionally homeless. I'm currently pregnant, and so I'm in priority need, so shouldn't be intentionally homeless. Now, if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, or if you know housing law a little bit, you'll know that that's a nonsensical argument, because priority need and intentional homelessness are two separate issues. They do not interact well, directly anyway. And so you might well be in priority need because you're pregnant, but that does not mean to say you will not be intentionally homeless. That's a completely different question. That's not to say that if you're pregnant there won't be any help from the council, but you won't be owed the main housing duty. That's kind of a short way of saying it. So that's what I put into ChatGPT. And within 3 or 4 seconds, it basically came out with this, and it gives you a nice template to work with. So it kind of, tells you to fill in your name and your address and all that sort of stuff, the date, and it kind of gives some just general blurb stuff. But the second paragraph here is kind of where the rubber hits the road, where it says, I'm currently pregnant, which places me in priority need for accommodation under the Housing Act 1996. So I didn't actually mention the Housing Act 1996 at all. It just realised that that's what I'm talking about. According to the law, pregnant women are considered to be in priority need, which again is true, and as such I should not be classified as intentionally homeless. That's not true. That's the bit which ChatGPT doesn't know what it's talking about. And it kind of gives some additional blurb, and I think down the line it kind of reiterates the same point. But in one sense, if you use that letter, that would get you nowhere at all, because you've not addressed the issue of whether or not you're intentionally homeless. You've just reiterated that they've already accepted you're in priority need by this stage, presumably. So this letter basically will be completely useless if you were to use it in the real world. And that's an example of, if you don't know what the law says in general, you're not going to be able to get ChatGPT to actually write anything sensible. But as we'll see in a minute, and certainly with the complaint actually, but with a few more review requests I've got examples of here, you can see that even a little bit of information goes a long way. So the next question I asked for ChatGPT was whether it could write me a Section 202 review request following a negative decision that I'm intentionally homeless. I have rent arrears, but the council did not explore whether I could afford my rent. My rent was £1,200 a month, but I only received £960 from Universal Credit. You might recognise this from a video I did yesterday about whether rent arrears means that you're intentionally homeless, and the answer is often it doesn't. So that's kind of the issue that we're talking about here, and ChatGPT does a great job here. I mean, it probably could be better, but it's a very good starting point which you might want to tweak around. So You know, kind of again gives you a bit of template stuff, you know, names, addresses, you know, insert the date of the decision, all that sort of stuff that's going to be very helpful. And then the third paragraph is where it starts looking at the actual issue. So to clarify, my rent is £1,200 a month, but I only receive £960 from UC. This leaves a shortfall of £240 per month. And notice I've not used the word shortfall in my question. It clearly can realise that shortfall is a word that associates with housing law, so it's got to put it in there, which I've struggled to cover. The decision did not take into account my limited income and the fact that I've been unable to make up the difference resulting in rent arrears. And again, it goes on to say, at no point was my ability to afford my rent assessed or explored by the council. I mean, you've got to assume that's true. In this case, often it will be. The council will just see rent arrears and assume that you're intentionally homeless. I would like to stress that the rent arrears were not caused by any deliberate action on my part, which again is useful, good law stuff. You know, it's good stuff, but rather due to my insufficient income. And then it kind of goes on to say, which again is helpful, I believe the decision does not reflect my genuine financial hardship and the difficulty I've had trying to meet my rent obligations with the limited funds available to me. And again, kind of just says a bit more about that. But that is, you know, that's a solid review request. It puts the review officer to task. It basically says what they need to look at, and in this case there's some cursory figures, and so what the review officer should do is then come back to this applicant and basically go through the sums in a lot more detail, which appears to be, you know, not the case in the Section 104 decision letter in the first place. So that's good. But I then tweaked that question and added in a bit. So I added in an additional sentence which says, paragraph 9.7 of the Homelessness Code of Guidance states that accommodation I was evicted from must have been reasonable to continue to occupy for me to be intentionally homeless, but the council did not take this into account. And which again, yeah, that's an example of using a bit of law to kind of give ChatGPT the ammunition it needs. So it adds in a paragraph here which says, furthermore, I'd like to draw your attention to paragraph 9.7 of the Homelessness Code of Guidance, which states that a person is only considered intentionally homeless if the accommodation they were evicted from was reasonable for them to continue occupying. The council decision did not take this into account, whether it was reasonable for me to continue to occupy the property, given my financial circumstances and a clear shortfall in my income relative to my housing costs. That's really, really good. That is, you know, that's the argument that needs to be made here. And again, other than kind of adding in some additional sums, which might be helpful, this again will basically put the review officer on notice as to what the failure was in the original decision and what the review officer needs to look into in detail. So this is great. You know, I'm not saying a solicitor couldn't do a better job, but I would say this is like 90% of the way there. And again, there might be some additional information you could, you know, put in there about other bits that are relevant. So that's a good example. I then asked ChatGPT, please write me a letter to challenge the council's decision that I'm intentionally homeless. I was evicted for antisocial behaviour, but I was subjected to domestic abuse whilst I lived in the accommodation, and a lot of the antisocial behaviour was my ex-partner breaking into the block of flats I was living in and damaging the premises. So again, this is based on in a case I was involved in not too long ago. And again, ChatGPT does some very interesting things here. So starts again with the usual blurb, you know, writing to formally challenge the decision, and then kind of goes into quite a lot of detail, which again is very interesting. I'm not quite sure how it knew to do this, but it did it. So whilst it is true that I was evicted from my previous accommodation due to antisocial behaviour, much of this behaviour was caused by my ex-partner who subjected me to domestic abuse throughout the time lived. I'd like to emphasise that the majority of the antisocial behaviour, including breaking into the block of flats where I lived and causing damage to the property, was carried out by my ex-partner. This behaviour was not a result of my own actions, but rather the actions of someone who had control over me during the course of the relationship. And then it says some more stuff, which again, you know, quite impressed by how it managed to do this. As a victim of domestic abuse, I was subjected to a great deal of coercion, fear and manipulation. This situation significantly impacted my ability to address this antisocial behaviour that was taking place in the building. Due to the nature of domestic abuse, I often felt trapped and unable to prevent the damage caused by my ex-partner. Additionally, I did not have the support or resources to leave the relationship until I was eventually able to do so. Now, if a human being did this, if they were advocating for this person, they would need to make absolutely sure that that is true, that those statements are true, that they were subjected to coercion and control and so on. You can't just kind of, you know, make this stuff up as ChatGPT has done. So you would need to make sure it's accurate and is actually, you know, essentially paraphrasing the client's own words. But again, it's clearly, you know, it's clearly taken into account a lot of the thinking around domestic abuse, and again, it's good stuff, assuming it's actually true about this individual's case. And then it goes on to say some other bits and pieces which are also useful. So I believe that given the circumstances, I should not be deemed intentionally homeless. The antisocial behaviour that led to my eviction was not a direct result of my own choices or actions, but instead heavily influenced by the abusive relationship I was in. I also feel that the council has not fully considered the impact of domestic abuse on my ability to prevent the antisocial behaviour or maintain my accommodation. Now, there's basically a fatal flaw in this letter, because What this doesn't address is the fact that some of the antisocial behaviour was the result of the victim. So if you look at the kind of, the question I've asked, there was a number of different things which were ASB, most of which were the perpetrator, but not all of it. And so what might happen if this was to go off to a review officer is they say, yeah, okay, now we'll take that into account. Yes, it wasn't you doing all the ASB, but you did some of it, and therefore we're still going to hold you to be intentionally homeless. And that's not a correct decision. As I say, what it hasn't done with the council is to raise the actual issue that's important, which again comes down to, was it reasonable to continue to occupy the accommodation? So I went back, I tweaked the question again and added some bits in here. So again, I just quoted 9.7 of the Code of Guidance. I'll just read it out. 9.7 of the Homelessness Code of Guidance states that for me to be intentionally homeless, the accommodation I was evicted from must have been reasonable for me to continue to occupy. Section 177 of the Housing Act 1996 states that if it is probable that remaining in my home would result in the risk of further domestic abuse, then it would not be reasonable to continue to occupy. Therefore, I'm not intentionally homeless. So within a couple of sentences there, that's essentially the argument that needs to be made in order to get this decision overturned. And effectively it kind of adds in some bits. So it adds in a couple of paragraphs which are great. So furthermore, I would like to draw your attention to paragraph 9.7 of the Homelessness Code of Guidance, which specifies that for someone to be considered intentionally homeless, the accommodation they were evicted from must have been reasonable for them to continue to occupy. It's changed the word slightly there, but it's good enough. The council has not fully taken into account that remaining in the property where I was being abused was not reasonable. That's essentially the argument that needs to be made. And then it goes on to mention section 177 of the Housing Act also makes it clear that if it is probable that remaining in the home would result in a risk of further domestic abuse, then it is not reasonable to continue to occupy that accommodation. So again, that is the argument that needs to be made, and it's been made pretty well. And again, there's some blurb around there just kind of summarising all that, which does a really good job. But that again is a very competent letter. Again, maybe a solicitor would be able to get more information. There might well be some evidence from other sources which would also be helpful to put in there. So for example, you might want to attach some safeguarding alerts that have been raised as a result of the abuse you suffered. It might be you're working with a domestic abuse advisor or something and kind of getting their input as well. But as a letter on its own, that is very good. That's good enough to get the decision overturned. So I'll do one more review request before I get to the complaint. And again, there's some interesting bits and pieces to this which I was surprised that ChatGPT could kind of figure out. So the question I asked it was, please write a letter challenging a decision that I'm not homeless. I'm living in a hostel and it is having a serious impact on my mental health. I was already getting psychotherapy for emotionally unstable personality disorder following a suicide attempt, and the hostel is making my mental health get much worse. Someone died in the hostel last week and there are constantly fights and drug dealing. People bang on my door and the staff don't do anything to stop it and don't listen to me. So not an unusual situation. I'm sure people who are watching this video might well be familiar with that kind of circumstance. And this is what it wrote. So again, usual sort of blurb, which is really helpful just to kind of set the letter out and kind of make it a letter. And then the second paragraph says that I'm currently residing in a hostel and I want to stress that this environment is having a profound and negative impact on my mental health. Prior to coming to the hostel, I was already receiving psychotherapy for EUPD and noticed that it's taken the emotionally unstable personality disorder and put the abbreviation in there, which again just kind of seems to be clever of how it's done that, which I was receiving treatment for after a suicide attempt. Despite this, the conditions in the hostel are making my mental health significantly worse to the point where I fear for my safety and well-being. And it goes on to a bit more detail, and again, you want to check that that's factually accurate, but it's good stuff in terms of the impact of the different circumstances having on them. Now, this argument here that we're seeing is actually one of the most difficult arguments to make within housing law. The idea that you are in accommodation, but because it's having a significant impact on your mental health, you are legally homeless. Now, it can be done. There's a case called Lomax v Gosport where it was kind of set out, but it's a high threshold. So most thresholds in housing law are low, but this is a high one. And what you effectively need to do is you need to state that you have a disability and show how that disability is being made worse by living in that accommodation, and therefore it's not reasonable to continue to occupy. And the first attempt, it does a pretty good job. Again, a lawyer could do a better job probably, but it's good enough, I think, to kind of raise the issue, because once you've made that review request, there are going to be further opportunities to input. For example, they've got a right-minded 2 letter down the line, so you've got those additional opportunities to kind of intervene. Now, what I then went back and kind of tweaked the wording of the question, I added in the fact that remaining in the hostel is putting me at risk of attempting suicide again. And ChatGPT actually basically took that down and said that's against our community guidelines, which again, it was interesting, but it did give me an answer still. So it kind of talks about, this environment is chaotic, unsafe, distressing, and it's contributing to a rapid decline in mental health. It does kind of give a lot of detail and kind of make the point, I think, very coherently, that living there with a lack of support and everything is going on there is actually, it's unreasonable to continue to occupy. So yeah, again, that's a good letter. As I say, it's a difficult argument to make, so I'm not sure how likely it is that that would actually overturn the decision, but it's a competent letter, and it opens the door for further representations to be made down the line. Again, you'd want, maybe your psychotherapist to have written a letter saying, yes, I've seen, Joe Blogs here, they've talked to me repeatedly about the impact this current hostel is having on their mental health. I believe it puts them at risk of suicide or whatever, and probably add that letter into the representations you then make. And then, so again, I'm hoping that's kind of made the point quite well that ChatGPT definitely can be good around the Section 202 review process. What I found it to be even better at was writing a complaint. So the final question I'll go through today, and I probably will do more videos about this in due course because I'm interested to see what the other limitations are of ChatGPT and other AI software. But the final question I asked was, please can you write a complaint to a council as I approached them for assistance as I was homeless, and they told me to go and rough sleep so the outreach team could find me, rather than assessing whether the council had a duty to house me immediately. Please address it to the council CEO. Which is, again, kind of what I always talk about in terms of just involving the CEO as soon as possible. And it does a great job. Again, I could tweak it and make it better, but again, it kind of gives you the usual sort of blurb. It sort of sets out what happened, and then it kind of gives these 4 kind of requests that make up the complaint, which is good practice. It's good to kind of say what you actually want. So firstly, a full explanation of the advice I was given by the council officer and why I was instructed to rough sleep in order to be found by the outreach team. So for those who aren't familiar with the situation, this is the kind of standard practice that gets pushed by central government, and I think also, I'm not sure if it still is, but it's kind of endorsed by some of the big kind of charities. They kind of get involved with it. It's not lawful, and it's also very unethical, and it's probably the worst thing you could tell someone who's actually homeless and in need of your help, to tell them that you don't believe them and go and tell them to go and rough sleep again so you can actually prove it, which again, not the law. So that's kind of interesting that it's even kind of asking for that. Secondly, an explanation of the council's procedures for assessing homelessness and whether my case was handled in line with the statutory guidelines of best practice. Those are all terms I did not use in the question, but they're really good. Thirdly, an apology for the distress and potential danger caused by the advice given to me. And fourthly, a review of the council's homelessness response procedures to ensure that individuals in need of housing assistance are treated with dignity and respect, and their safety is prioritised. This is brilliant. However, there's one thing I added into the tweak, which was to say that in accordance with the Ombudsman's guidance, I believe I should receive £300 for the distress and inconvenience caused by the council's failure. And so effectively, it just added in an additional point, or replaced one of the points. So fourthly, a compensation of £300 in line with the Ombudsman's guidance for distress and inconvenience caused by the council's failure to appropriately assess my situation and offer the necessary support. That is a complaint which will go the distance, basically, provided the facts are true, as in you did approach the council and they did tell you to go and sleep rough. Sometimes officers will tell you that, but they won't record the fact they've told you that. So again, that might make it a bit more tricky, because some housing officers are very dodgy. Bottom line, that's the way it is. But this complaint will go, and just bear in mind, as I always say, the first stage complaint will never be upheld. They'll always deny it. They'll always say some nonsense about whatever. I've only ever had one complaint which was upheld on the first stage, and that was a very complicated situation. Second stage, there's a chance you'll get the 300 quid and an apology. It may well be you've got to take it to the local government and social care ombudsman, but this will be this will be exactly what they're looking for. You've kind of laid out what the facts, you've laid out what the failure is, and you've laid out what it is you want to happen. That's a great complaint. So again, I'm going to play around this a bit more, but I thought this would be a useful video for you guys if you're using ChatGPT or other sort of similar software to write letters. I'd love to hear kind of stories of how it's worked, and kind of if there are other limitations or other strengths that it has that kind of help people out there. Because bottom line is, when you're homeless, do you have 2 hours to sit down and write a detailed complaint or a kind of coherent complaint, or do you just go on ChatGPT and just basically do it in 5 minutes? I think it makes it a lot more straightforward for people to kind of raise these issues robustly. The one downside I can foresee, and this might seem like a bit of a weird one, is that if you are arguing that you are vulnerable because you struggle to manage your affairs, you struggle with letter writing and that sort of thing, but you get ChatGPT to write a banging letter for you, the officer is likely to say, well, you wrote this letter, it was great, you obviously can manage your own affairs and look after yourself. So you might just want to specify potentially that you wrote it using ChatGPT as a way of just kind of saying, this is not my day-to-day job, this is not something I'd usually be able to kind of go into as much detail on, and just kind of, as I say, kind of head them off at the pass a little bit. As I say, stick in the comments if if you've got any examples of using this. I think it could be really useful. I think it's only going to get better in terms of its understanding of homelessness law. How it learns it, I don't know. So I don't know if it's going to learn it anyway, or whether the powers that be have to kind of tell it to learn about housing law. And as I say, it's a long way off, I think, from replacing a solicitor. But it's not, you know, given how far it's come in, like, whatever, 5 years, whatever it's been around, I can imagine in 5 years, actually, you know, this whole legal process could largely be done by AI. Which has all sorts of implications. But anyway, for the time being, let's just kind of focus on the useful bit, and this definitely is useful, even if it doesn't actually understand housing law. So you do need to be careful in terms of what you're asking it to do, because if you tell it something wrong, you're going to get something wrong out of it. But yeah, anyway, hope that helps. As always, if you found this video useful, do give it a like, do give it a subscribe. If you do subscribe, you'll get notifications of new videos, and as you'll see on the channel, there's a lot of content on there, a lot of hours that we cover, just kind of, you know, useful stuff that you need to know if you're homeless. I had a comment on one of the videos the other day, just basically saying, you know, how annoying and how unjust it is that people have to know about housing law and advocate for themselves to get justice, and how she was beginning to realise how maybe homeless people exist not because they can't manage their own tenancy, but because they can't navigate this ridiculous bureaucracy that is housing law. So yeah, anyway, take it easy, guys. I hope that was helpful.